Okay, so let's start at the beginning of when you came into the Congress. You were swept into this place on a sea of Democrats.
That's correct.
What was that like?
Well, I was too dumb to know how dangerous it was. I just looked around at my district, which had been a Republican district and continues to be one, and I was delighted at winning the election, but I didn't attribute any cosmic consequences to it. But when I got here, I found out we were a rare breed. And Carl Albert was the speaker, an interesting man. And I think one of the first things I did was meet Millicent Fenwick, which made me ready for just about anything.
Was she wearing a hat?
No, but she was smoking a pipe. And it was aromatic, which I thanked her for. But Millicent was one of the most charming, delightful persons I had the good fortune to meet. She and I used to have lunch occasionally and exchange witticisms. She would quote some famous poet or pundit, and I would try to match her. And I can't say I ever matched her very much. One of her great lines to me was, "We proud men pompously compete for nameless graves, while some foundling of fate stumbles his way into immortality." That was the sort of thing that we exchanged back and forth.
So what you're saying is, even though the Democrats were massively in control, and you were a member at that time of a tiny minority, relatively speaking to today's differences, the relations between members of parties were fairly cordial?
At certain levels they were, but not pervasively so. We were tolerated barely. But as for getting something done, it was very difficult to do.
If you were a Republican?
Yeah, that's right. The Democrats controlled the committees, the subcommittees, the administration of the House, and they, as I say, barely tolerated us.
Much is made by those who like to reminisce about the good old days of Congress, about more cordial relations between members of opposite parties. They used to dine together, the weeks were longer, they spent more time together, there was more interaction between members and families. Is that true or not?
It seems to be true. When I got here, you had the older members who seemed more convivial and able to get along with each other. Silvio Conti was an outspoken Republican appropriator, but at the same time was a dear friend to Tip O'Neill. Bob Michel, who was our leader after John Rhodes, was very close to Tip O'Neill. So there were friendships that manifested themselves quite a bit. There were some sharp edges around with some of the members, but it seemed the older, more professional politician, as against the eager, younger, I want to reform the world type, seemed to get along better. And it was, Claude Pepper was one of the great debaters. He would always refer to you as my learned friend. And of course, it's hard to get mad at someone who's pronouncing you as a learned friend.
Well, I want to ask you about that part of the change a little bit later, but I want to sort of stay in a somewhat of a chronological line and ask you about your first major legislative accomplishment. Brand new in the House, at the height of the women's movement, right after the Supreme Court had made the Roe versus Wade decision that made it possible for women to get legal abortions in every state. You passed the first major piece of legislation restricting abortion by prohibiting the use of federal funds. Did you have any idea at the time that you would be the person who would be the leader of what has now become a very robust pro-life movement in the Congress?
No, I had no idea. It was all quite fortuitous or accidental. I got into the issue about 1968 when I was a member of the Illinois General Assembly in the House. And a member there had a bill liberalizing abortion. At that time, it was a crime in Illinois and most states. And his bill was in the vanguard of the liberalizing movement. And he asked me if I would co-sponsor it. I was pretty ignorant about the subject, and I said, let me study it. I got a book called The Vanishing Right to Live by Charles Rice, a professor at Notre Dame, and it covered the death penalty, assisted suicide, abortion, all of the various life and death issues. And I read it, and I decided that I couldn't co-sponsor the bill. I had to oppose it. So I opposed it. It's a subject nobody likes to talk about, nobody likes to really think about. And I found myself a cult of one, getting up and being willing to debate this issue. But I became convinced it was right, and I decided to fight abortion, and so I did in the state legislature. And when I got to Washington, I found a different climate. Nobody did anything. They filed constitutional amendments prohibiting abortion and then forgot about them. Nothing ever happened. One day on the floor, they were debating the funding for the Department of Health and Human Services. Then it was Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW. And I was on the floor quite by accident in the back of the chamber, and Bob Bauman, who was then a member from Maryland, sidled up to me and said, Henry, there's $50 million to pay for 300,000 Medicare abortions in this bill. We could knock that out if you want. I said, sure, why don't you? He said, oh, everybody knows where I'm coming from. You're an unknown quantity. Why don't you do it? I said, sure, I'll do it. We got some paper and wrote with a pencil an amendment striking that appropriation from the bill. And I stood up and said, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk. And we were off and running, quite by accident. Just that's the way it happened. And we debated it, and nobody expected us to win, but we did.
You were vilified by the abortion rights people.
The ladies in the chamber were Bella Abzug, Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, who later was Attorney General of California, Pat Schroeder, a pretty hefty crew of opponents to my position. So they demanded a separate vote at the end of the bill, and we got a bigger vote against abortion than we got the first time. The senators were confident the court would knock it out as not equal protection of the law or some other constitutional theory, and so they didn't fight the bill. They knew it would go down, and it went to federal court in New York. Judge Dooling, I'll never forget because I testified. And we finally won that case in the U.S. Supreme Court, Harris versus McRae. So that's how it happened, quite by accident.
How do you now feel about that achievement?
Well, I think when I appear before the final judge, that may be the only thing I'll have on my side. So I think it was substantive. we stopped federal funding. We didn't stop abortions, but the Supreme Court decided that the right to do something did not require the right to be funded for it. Free speech is a right we all have, but the government doesn't have to buy us a megaphone. And so one may have the right to abort their child, their unborn child, but the government doesn't have to pay for it. And that's been the law ever since. That was an accomplishment, and we've had some steamy debates on that. Miss McKinney got in one of them once that added a little flavor to our discussion, and but we've prevailed so far, and I'm proud of that.